Welcome to JFK Facts Podcast, featuring news, analysis, and discussions of issues relevant to the study of President Kennedy's assassination. My name is Alan Dale, courtesy of the editor and founder of JFK Facts, Jefferson Morley. Today we feature a special program and a special guest, a person whose distinguished career includes his roles as a respected educator and academic, an esteemed authority on Danish philosopher Søren Kierkegaard, an internationally best-selling author, and for more than 35 years, a respected private detective and crime scene investigator. He's the author of 1967's 6 Seconds in Dallas, 1988's Gumshoe, Reflections in a Private Eye, and 2021's Last Second in Dallas. I'm very honored to introduce Dr. Josiah Thompson. Welcome to JFK Facts. Thank you for being with us.
Great to be with you, Alan.
Happy to have you, that's for sure. If there is biggest news relating to the number of books that have been published recently, which focus upon elements of investigation into President Kennedy's assassination, I would say that unquestionably the biggest news is the publication of Last Second in Dallas, 54 years after 6 Seconds in Dallas from 1967. You have shared with me the fact that within the world of JFK research, it's quite common to find people who work or seem to work under the assumption that you have to answer every question relating to President Kennedy's assassination, as if we could, right? But that's not your attitude, and neither is it your objective, I think, what you've set out to do with the publication of Last Second in Dallas.
Right, exactly. I think, and this, by the way, is a principle that I learned not as a professor or scholar, but as a criminal investigator. I've investigated a whole bunch of murders over 35 years. And when I look back over the investigation of those murders, there's not a single one where all the questions were answered when we went to trial, where we knew everything. You don't. A murder happens and it interrupts the ordinary course of business in an ordinary day. And the number of questions that flow out of a particular event which occurs right in the middle of an ordinary day are immense. For example, with the Kennedy assassination, many people think that you have to answer all the questions to really get to the bottom of the event. For example, was Kennedy hit by an incoming bullet in the throat, or was a little hole caused by an exiting bullet or a fragment? I don't know the answer to that question. I don't know of any good answer to that question at this point. Or was Kennedy hit, or next, exactly when was Connolly hit? Was it simultaneous with a hit on Kennedy, or did it come some other time? Did the same bullet that hit Connolly in the chest also cause the wound in his right wrist? What bullet in the fusillade of bullets hit Tague? Is a single bullet correct or incorrect? To many of these questions, I don't know the answer. And for many of these questions, I don't think they really require answers for us to know what happened in the Kennedy assassination.
May not be of ultimate or essential significance, some of those questions.
Right. And as I began to think over how I worked in criminal cases for 35 years, it became clear to me that there are questions and then there are questions, and that all questions are not equal in their significance or importance, obviously.
Okay.
Now, let me take you back to how the defense works in a criminal case. You get the case, you get the police reports, you get, a whole bunch of stuff. And the chief counsel sits down with the chief investigator, and you figure out, what's your strategy going to be? How are you going to defend this case? Well, the importance is to not get sidetracked into answering questions that really don't matter.
That are not relevant.
What do I mean by matter?
Okay.
By matter, I mean the jury's going to decide this. So that's what a criminal case is. It's a competition between two different views as to what happened and who did it and how they did it, et cetera, et cetera. So what you're looking for are questions that will affect the jury's minds in some really pivotal way that will bring the victory for the defense that you're looking for. So I just applied that to the Kennedy assassination. Mm-hmm. And I said to myself, okay, folks, what is the critical question here? Well, I came up with an answer to that.
Okay.
And that answer I want to call the threshold question, because I believe that Last Second in Dallas has answered this threshold question, and I think that's the most important question to ask and or answer in the Kennedy assassination. What's the threshold question? The threshold question is whether or not you can show, given the valid evidence about what happened in Dealey Plaza, that shots were fired at the limousine, hit in the limousine from more than one direction. And I think finally, now, for the first time, we can answer that question definitively.
Well, it's funny that you say for the first time, because I'm mindful in studying other historical events, whether we're talking about, really almost anything you can think of that is worthy of making it into the history books. It takes time, sometimes a great deal of time, for the truth, or perhaps I should say the facts, to emerge in a way where there ultimately is a consensus among investigators or scholars or historians or academics or whomever. And I think I understand that at a couple of different times, more than once, during the course of your focus on issues relevant to President Kennedy's assassination, you felt like there was no progress that was available immediately. And so you went to Copenhagen and wrote about Søren Kierkegaard. So you had to wait it out.
Alan, you're absolutely right, and I think if you're going to think of other historical events, of other assassinations, consider the 1914 assassination of Franz Ferdinand and his wife at Sarajevo, which ultimately led to the beginning of World War I.
Of course,
that took decades to get to the bottom of this one.
Right.
You're absolutely right. And look, I've written this book as a variant of an earlier book I wrote called Gumshoe, which was about me, a wet behind the ears philosophy professor, entering the strange world of the private investigator and of criminal defense, etc. So this is really just a story of what I experienced vis-a-vis the Kennedy assassination over, 55 years or so now, or about that.
Yeah.
And you're right. At a certain point, back in 1979 it was, that's 10, 12 years after 6 Seconds was published, I was invited by Peter Dale Scott to... He had a contract with Random House for a big book on the Kennedy assassination, coming out now after the report of the House Select Committee on Assassinations. My job would be to deal with that part of the House HSCA investigation of what happened in Dealey Plaza.
Mm-hmm.
So I went to work, and what I found was frankly appalling. I found that the core evidence in the case, that is, the evidence that backed the solution to important questions in the case, was now in conflict. It was heterogeneous.
Mm-hmm.
That can't happen. We know events happen in one way rather than another. And if the evidence is real evidence and it's gathered properly, then all the evidence should be homogeneous. That is, it should fit together like a puzzle.
Except in the case of the JFK story.
Yeah, that's what I found when I looked at what the core evidence in the case was, say in December 1978, when the House Select Committee had its final hearing and got set to issue its report. I found that the evidence was hopelessly in conflict, was heterogeneous. Well, that can't be for an event. I knew that too. So what that meant was that some of these, quote, facts that we were taking to be facts about the Kennedy assassination were not facts at all. But I had no way on this planet to determine definitively which facts were real facts and which weren't. So I gave up.
You know, you're living what Immanuel Kant would have lived through if he had been in exactly the same position you were at that time.
Immanuel Kant. You take me back to my academic days. Yes, right. The philosopher of Königsberg.
That's exactly right. This is really a case, a lesson, really, about recognizing when it's time to back off instead of being absolutely adamant and declarative, usually biased about things, relating to your own predisposition in terms of conclusions. You chose to say, hey, we've got evidence that President Kennedy was shot from the front. We've got evidence that he was shot from behind. We're going to have to give this some time, and maybe the science will catch up to it.
Well, I don't want to appear to have a wisdom that I don't deserve, because what happened at that time was I didn't have a clue what to do.
Yeah.
I didn't know what to do. It's clear that some of the evidence doesn't belong there, and you can't tell which pieces of evidence it is. I didn't know what to do. Mm-hmm. So I just went off and had a long career in investigation.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. There's a chronology that is relevant to your personal work relating to President Kennedy's assassination. And I would point out, for the benefit of anybody who is concerned about the consequences to one's mental health, I would point out how important it is to have other things to focus upon in life, as opposed to perhaps certain cases of figures that we would recognize by name who have been completely immersed in the JFK thing at the exclusion of everything else, and maybe to their detriment. But you've had an awful lot of time and an awful lot of experience doing other things while a chronology unfolds in the JFK story, which you represent within the pages of Last Second in Dallas. And some of this chronology pertains to a group of people, and we don't have to spend an enormous amount of time on each of them. But I would point out that there were things that I knew nothing about, not least of which was, of all people, Mary Farrell playing a role of consequence with the HSCA in 1977. Could we talk about that for a moment?
You bet. Some wags have pointed out that who's the guy played by Tom Hanks in this wonderfully funny movie of maybe 10 or 15 years ago. I've just forgotten his name. This guy turns out to stumble in and be present at all sorts of historical events.
Oh, of course. Yeah. Yes. How can we both blank on his probably most successful role? Forrest Gump.
It's a
Forrest Gump.
Funny role.
Forrest Gump.
President. He just stumbles into being president and all these historical events.
Including being in the Oval Office as Forrest Gump in the Oval Office.
That's it. It's Forrest. Okay.
He's in with JFK having a Dr. Pepper.
Thompson, you're like the Forrest Gump of the Kennedy assassination.
That's right.
You're there. Well, I was there.
Yes.
I think it was September 17th, 1977.
Yeah.
When
Mary Farrell.
Bob Blakey, newly appointed chief counsel for the House Select Committee, convened a conference of critics and brought us all to Washington. I remember Sylvia. I could go through the list of people there, but it's all the usual suspects.
Right.
and it was getting. It was a hot day in September. And I was sitting there, and I had lunch. I started to fall asleep in this large seminar room. And I thought to myself, Thompson, here it is. You worked hard in trying to get this case reinvestigated. Now, finally, here you are in Washington with the chief counsel over there.
Sound asleep.
Yeah. Right. Well, so
that's great.
So I roused myself, and Mary Farrell spoke up. And she said, this radio guy, the radio guy turns out to have been Gary Mack, brought to me these tapes of Dallas radio channels. And they'd cleaned them up at Gary's radio station. And he said you could hear there were shots on them, recorded on this radio channel. And I looked over at Blakey's face, and I could see the shadow cross over his face. Oh God, no.
Yeah, right.
Now, because it's been made with all these critics sitting around the room, I got to do something about it.
Isn't that terrible? Yeah.
I need this like a hole in the head.
Exactly. Right.
So that was actually the moment when the investigation into the acoustics evidence began.
That's wild, man. I did not know that she played that role on that occasion. That's significant.
Oh, but look, Mary Farrell deserves an enormous credit. I mean, well, like a lot of these earlier critics of the Warren Report, especially Sylvia Marr. Sylvia and I were tight friends.
Well, I've heard you make that statement on more than one occasion, and I would always say, with all due respect to Vince Salandria, without whom you and I might not be having this conversation, you are a first-generation researcher. I mean, your research began the weekend of the assassination, where you ended up on the following Monday, I think, in an FBI office trying to draw to their attentions an incongruity that was offensive to you.
Yeah. What I was in New Haven just about to get my PhD in philosophy, and then start teaching at that point.
Yeah.
And I looked at the New York Times that Tuesday, and it contained a story which was absolutely antithetical to what Life magazine said in its article while publishing the Zapruder film. Yeah. It was clear from the Life magazine article that the sixth floor corner window was directly behind Kennedy. And
yet,
the New York Times article contained the report of Dr. Malcolm Perry that he had incised Kennedy's throat through a pre-existing bullet wound in the front.
Exactly.
Right?
Yeah.
This didn't make any sense. So look, with these two hot sources of privileged information, Life magazine in one hand and the New York Times in the other, I traipsed down to the local FBI office. And there I asked to see an agent who behaved very, very much like the movie FBI agents should behave. Yes, young man, what do you have for the FBI? I I told him this. I told him all this, and he nodded his head and took a few notes. And I'm sure this went into the wastebasket as soon as I left.
No, it really went into a new security
as to how weird Yale graduate students were.
Thus began a long history of things being placed in your security file by the federal government.
Indeed, right.
It's very funny. So continuing with this contrived theme of mine, that there's a chronology here that you're the right person to represent to us, because it is also the chronology of your story in relation to this aspect of the focus of your attention, this thing that has been a part of your awareness and very much the focus of your attention to a greater or lesser extent ever since November 22nd of 1963. So there's this chronology of
but I'd like to interrupt here to say, look, this is not just my story. There are a bunch of very kind of hard-headed, obstinate people who, from the very beginning of this case, didn't buy the government cover-up, basically.
Thank God, yeah.
And over time, their case, our case, has gotten better and better. In other words, there are a bunch of people who got into this for no better reason than we wanted to find out what happened. Mm-hmm. It was that simple. And over time, I think we have.
I think that I'm reminded of something that Dr. John Newman has represented to me rather emphatically. He was, a career Army intelligence officer and analyst and all of that.
Distinguished career. Right.
Very. Ends up landing as they created a position for him to serve as the military assistant to the director of the National Security Agency, General William Odom. But along the way, he had a title. He was promoted to be something called a strategic intelligence cryptologic analyst. A strategic intelligence cryptologic analyst, and from there became an intelligence management authority. And that put him in charge, really, of two separate staffs. And this is relevant to our discussion.
Yeah.
One staff is a group of people whose job is data collection. And they use electronic mechanisms and whatever are the hardware necessary to collect data. And there's really actually a very broad range of what that will include. But the other staff are data analysts, and Dr. Newman has represented to me this necessary construct, a matter of the methodology, which subjects successive round after round after round of data collection, then turning it over to the analysts, where it is revised and refined and then sent back to the data collectors, and then they refocus their collection relevant to what has just happened with the analysts, so that eventually, but it takes time, some kind of refined and ultimate intelligence assessment can be reported to whomever. And it occurs to me, listening or reading your story and the way that you have participated in this chronology over all of these years, this book, you and I have talked for years about your intent and your desire, your hope that there would be a bookend to 1967's 6 Seconds in Dallas. This book had to wait this many years to be published.
Yeah, I think it did, and I think that you're very interesting and rich and relation of how data collection and data analysis works in the intelligence world is by exactly how science operates.
Yes, exactly.
And that is what's happened here. Mm-hmm. In other words, what happened to the Kennedy assassination was not that the investigation was corrupted or undermined by a bunch of bozos from the public world who put their series out on the Kennedy assassination. No. The Kennedy assassination was corrupted by bad scientists. And bad science requires bad scientists to do it. And for a long time, the facts that we're talking about, the questions which ended up with the wrong answers, were wrong answers that were sponsored by very distinguished scientists themselves.
Yes, yeah. Dr. Aguilar has done a very brilliant presentation on confirmation bias and made very specific analysis of particular people relevant to what you're describing.
Yeah. So look, I turned away from the Kennedy assassination in basically 1969, 1970. I took a Guggenheim Fellowship and went to Denmark and wrote a biography of Søren Kierkegaard.
Yeah.
And that was it for me for a long time. And it was only, I guess, around 2010, 2011 that I recognized that fairly monumental changes had occurred in what was considered the core evidence in the case. Now, I didn't bring about these changes. All these discoveries and changes were brought about by the hard work of other people. The Forrest Gump of the Kennedy assassination just happened along and collected what these other people had done.
Well, on behalf of an indifferent nation, thank you for your service. You're bringing me to some of these other people that have played a consequential role in the story that you are representing to us within the pages of Last Second in Dallas. One of the very important figures. Actually, let me just rattle these off to you, and then you can say whatever you choose, because I realize we don't have all the time that we would want to have. Let me give you four names: Eric Randich, David Wimp, Keith Fitzgerald, he's probably the most recent addition to this list, and James Barger.
Boy.
Where to begin?
Well, let's begin with Barger, because James Barger, since 1978, etc., has emerged as a true legend in the field of acoustics, etc. He was way back in 1977. In 77. James Blakey had to find an expert to look at what Mary Farrell had commented upon, right?
Right.
And he went to the Society of American Acoustics, which is what it sounds like. This gathers together all the major acoustic scientists in the country. It's their professional organization. And he asked them who he should hire to do this job of analyzing the Dallas police tapes and finding out whether there were shots on them. They unanimously said only one person, the number one person in the field, is James Barger. Barger earlier had worked with a team from BBN in Cambridge. This was the firm he worked with for a lifetime, a wonderful firm. He had earlier worked on the gap in the Nixon tapes.
Yes.
And was partially responsible for the conclusion that the gap was voluntary, was not
erased deliberately.
Was not erased
accidentally,
mechanically or accidentally.
Right.
That it was deliberate. In addition, he had done the study of the shooting at Kent State, where several students were shot, and determined that the first shot came from a small knot of Ohio National Guardsmen who were there.
Really?
And that conclusion was later backed by court testimony of the guardsman who admitted that it had occurred that way. So and what I found out in sort of nosing around in the field of acoustics, I traveled to Florida at one point to interview the reigning expert in what's called speech identification. James Barger is now a legendary figure in the field, subsequent to the House Select Committee. I was very much intimidated by who Barger was, and I wondered whether at this point in time he might have just had enough of the Kennedy assassination.
It happens. Yes.
Right. So I was very reluctant to contact him, but I did back in 2015, and he and his people did a few rather simple tests and experiments, and we've been working together ever since. He has now, I think, demonstrated that the acoustics evidence is not only valid, but really explosive in its meaning, and that's characterized in the fourth part of Last Second in Dallas. So that's Barger. And also, when I wrote to Barger, I still remember this. He wrote back a wonderfully. I had simply asked for help in finding someone who could do some acoustics experiments for me.
Yeah.
And he wrote back a wonderfully direct letter in which he said that probably the first thing we ought to do is to take a look at the evidence ourselves. Right.
Well.
Well.
That's an unusual, unanticipated response.
And then he went on to say, I noticed in your CV, Thompson, that I'm a month older than you are, and that we both got our PhDs in the same month, and that we were both commissioned ensign in the U.S. Navy in the same month.
Brethren.
So exactly. So we started off on a great way, and it's been a great run. Now, who were the other three?
Well, I would say really David Wimp. I mentioned Eric Randich, David Wimp, and Keith Fitzgerald, who doesn't come into the picture until relatively recently. But
well, let's talk about Keith Fitzgerald.
Okay.
Unfortunately, I learned this last year that Keith Fitzgerald had died.
I'm sorry to hear that.
In 2017, I believe. Keith Fitzgerald stands as a model of what I think investigation of the Kennedy assassination should be about. Keith Fitzgerald learned analysis while he was in the Army. I met him in 2005 when he came to the AARC conference in Bethesda.
Right.
And he came to me and he said that he came all the way from New Hampshire not to go to this conference but to see me. And that he wanted to tell me that he'd looked closely at my figures published in 6 seconds, and it was clear to him that there was that a shot was fired into Kennedy's head from the rear at frame 327, between frame 327 and 328. So we had lunch, and he had done a marvelous job in analyzing the evidence around this, and had come up with a solution to one of these odd questions that haunt you in the Kennedy assassination. It turns out that the people on the north side of Elm Street, the witnesses there, the Newmans, Emmett Hudson, other people like that, they all saw Kennedy hit in the head, and were aware that it was above the right temple and that his head and body was thrown backwards and to the left.
And that's at
Right?
frame 313. That's the big
That's the
explosive. Yeah.
Right, exactly. Whereas the people on the other side of the street, most notably James Altkins, the photographer who took a number of iconic photographs of the assassination.
Yeah.
James Altkins, and then the Franson family, who were standing on the south side, a bit down the hill, down Elm Street from Altkins, and Charles Brame.
Yeah.
All these people all talk of Kennedy being hit in the back of the head, it would seem, his body thrown forward, and items of impact debris from the from the impact on his head being thrown forward towards them. As a matter of fact, CBS, who in 1967 were trying to prove that the Warren Commission was right, used Altkins as a witness that Kennedy had been hit in the back of the head and that this material had been thrown forward. Well, what Fitzgerald recognized was all the people on the north side of the street were viewing one shot, and the people on the south side of the street were viewing a second shot.
It makes sense.
Three quarters of a second later, they were all telling exactly the truth as to what they saw.
Well, it makes sense. It makes sense.
Right. But Keith Fitzgerald stands for what? Your citizen's investigator. He just wanted to find out, right? So he came down, and I ultimately got to New Hampshire and got to see him there. But he stands for the very best in this whole racket, as it were.
Could you describe to me briefly what you recall about the process by which you realized, because I'm well acquainted with the environment in these JFK conferences. I've ran the show for several of them for years.
You have, Alan. Of all people, you have, right?
Yeah. But I would wonder what exactly you recall, if anything, about how it is you realized or how quickly you realized that this guy wasn't going to waste your time, because there are all kinds of strange people who gravitate towards controversial subjects.
Yeah, I think, as I put in the book, most of these conferences always have a wild-eyed individual who believes that the Rosicrucians built here or something, right?
Yeah. Right. Something like that.
This guy was just solid. I mean, look, in the PI world, your judgments about people are crucial.
Yeah.
You better not be wrong about people, because based upon your judgments of them, they may end up as witnesses for your side or not.
Yeah, but it's just so imaginable to me, so effortlessly imaginable for him to be the real kind of thing and to have zeroed in on a particular scholar and then to be blown off, fluffed off because...
Well, the basis, he started out by pulling 6 seconds out of his briefcase and turning to an obscure appendix in 6 seconds, which lists the movement of Kennedy's head under impact. And he said, you had it back then. You had it just right back then, because look at what happens to Kennedy's head after 3:27. It takes off forward. It accelerates forward at the highest speed ever in the whole case, according to you.
Well, I can tell you this is a revelation to it will be a revelation to a lot of people who have always assumed that frame 313, which is the explosive, dramatic, memorable, indelible moment where President Kennedy's head explodes, that is the end of the sequence. And what you're describing and what you're documenting rather explicitly is that there was an additional headshot.
3/4 of a second later.
In other words, not enough time to rifle through the process of a manual bolt-action World War II vintage rifle.
Right, which according to the FBI, Robert Frazier's the head of their marksman, fired it and found that it could not be fired twice in less than 2.3 seconds.
Yeah.
So it's not even close. And that, folks, is why I believe that the threshold question answers everything. Mm-hmm. Everything important in the case. Now, there's an oddity here. There is the last second of the assassination runs from, say, 3:12 to add 18 frames onto that, and you're where? At 3:30, right?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
That also happens to be, it's amazing to me that I've been dealing with this Zapruder film for 50 years and hadn't recognized. My God, that's the point in that last second. That's the point where the limousine makes its closest approach to Zapruder's camera. Mm-hmm. At other points, when the car is farther up Elm Street,
right,
2 or 3 times farther away from the camera. Well, what that means is that during that last second, you can see things in terms of details going on in the limousine mm-hmm. that you couldn't see earlier. Mm-hmm. So the critical question turns out to be answered by the critical sequence in the Zapruder film, when you can see more in the Zapruder film than you could see at any other point.
Mm-hmm. What's your thought? How do you feel? How do you respond to the great number of people, many of whom have either a casual or other interest in these subjects, related subjects? How do you feel about the people who declare absolutely that the relying upon the Zapruder film is dubious because they believe that it has been altered, materially altered in ways that make it unreliable?
I rely on expert opinion, mm-hmm. specifically the expert opinion of Raleigh Zavada. Raleigh Zavada is in his early 90s now, and Raleigh Zavada was hired by the what's the committee that came into existence?
The ARRB, Assassination Records Review Board.
Yeah, the AARB. Thank you, thank you.
Right.
I can't keep all the letters straight.
Oh no, I see it. Yes, it's alphabet soup. ARRB, Assassination Records Review Board,
right.
In the mid-1990s.
Right. Well, Raleigh Zavada spent his career as a physical chemist for Kodak, and he was part of the team that actually developed Kodacolor 2, of which the Zapruder film is an example. And Raleigh and I have talked endlessly about the claims of, oh, good Lord, should I mention his name or not?
No,
James?
But we know lots of people who are just dismissive because it conflicts with whatever, their position happens to be.
Yeah, right. Well, what's important is that now we've got a very interesting check on the Zapruder film, the acoustics evidence.
Uh-huh.
Right?
Yes.
So now we have sound evidence which indicates shots at the same times, at least 4 shots, 3, 4, and 5. Mm-hmm. We have evidence in the Zapruder film that shots were fired at those particular time locations.
Remind me of the man that you interviewed back so many years ago, who was on, Sam was on the bridge, he was on the overpass.
Sam Holland.
Sam Holland, he was very declarative from right out of the gate, unless I'm mistaken, and in this case I don't think I am. Am I correct that he said he heard 4 distinct shots?
At least 4, he said. He said probably the best recounting of his view on this. He didn't change his testimony ever from the afternoon when he executed an affidavit at the sheriff's department. Mm-hmm. He said 4 or 5. He couldn't be sure.
Oh, I'm
sorry.
Here's
the point. Here's the point. You have to start in this case with the most elementary elements of proof, and that involves if Kennedy is hit twice in the head, which is what's being offered here. Mm-hmm. Then first, the movement of Kennedy's head under impact, right?
Yes.
Secondly, and backup for that, the throw of impact debris from the impact on his head.
Right.
Okay. Mm-hmm. Now because that takes us down to a kind of primitive level of the event, right? What we're dealing with there is physics. That's all, mm-hmm. right? Okay, here's what we got. The medical evidence indicates that Kennedy was hit near the top of his head on the right-hand side, just aft of the hairline for the right temple. Mm-hmm. It was a tangential shot in that it did not enter a flat-on side of the head, but a curved side of the head, which the head of neurosurgery for Parkland, Dr. Kem Clark, pointed out. That kind of a hit, a tangential hit, does a lot more damage, requires a lot more energy transfer to the skull, and does a lot more damage than a flat onset. So that's basically what happened. His head and body was then thrown backwards and to the left. Mm-hmm. And Don DeLillo wrote a book called Libra and studied the Zapruder film over and over again. Mm-hmm. And he said in an interview for the Paris Review that you look at that film and every cell in your body screams that Kennedy was hit from the right front. Yeah. And that's true. Mm-hmm. Because all these clues that we use as ordinary people to interpret the world around us, all these clues are telling us that. Yeah. And then Kennedy's body encounters the upright back seat cushion and bounces forward.
Right. Yeah.
So, now, consider the impact debris, and I think this is one of the most important things we have. There are 2 motorcyclists. Bobby Hargis is riding the inboard cycle off the left quarter of the limousine. Mm-hmm. Another cyclist is riding the outboard cycle. Bobby Hargis got hit such a blow to the chest and helmet and body that he says he thought he was shot by a bullet.
Yeah. B.J. Martin was the guy on the outside.
E.J. Martin, great.
B.J., yeah. Mm-hmm.
He then, as soon as he recognized he hasn't been shot, he says, well, since I got hit with all this stuff,
right,
I figured it came from the right front. So I parked my cycle, and we have photographs. We show him parking. He parks his cycle in the left gutter of Elm Street and turns towards the knoll and then crosses the street, etc., up towards the knoll. Yeah. That's Bobby Hargis. Now, here's a recent discovery that was made by Doug DeSalles here in the San Francisco area.
Yes.
Here's another oddity, right? Something that doesn't make a lot of sense. And Doug solved it. Martin is the outboard, riding just off the back wheel of Hargis.
Yeah, closer to the curb, the opposite curb.
his right side is closest to Kennedy,
yes.
right?
Mm-hmm.
So one would expect him to get the blow of this material on the right side. He doesn't. He comments that he only got impact debris on his helmet and on his uniform and on the cycle on the outside or left side, right? How? Doug DeSalle solved it about 3 months ago.
Oh?
He got together all the pictures as to where these cyclists and other people were at 313.
Yes.
It turns out that Hargis shielded Martin.
That's what I was thinking.
Blast of impact debris.
Yeah. Also makes sense. And what does that do to the idea that that shot, that impact, was the result of something from behind and elevated?
Right. Exactly. No, it's the velocity of the particles, right?
Yes.
The fact that this impact debris was thrown at such a high speed, right? Mm-hmm. Which indicates that obviously it had to come from the right front.
Gotcha.
Also, there was impact debris on the windshield of the follow-up car, on the left arm of the driver of the follow-up car, and on Clint Hill's forehead, right?
Yes.
So when we get down to this level, right, to the level of physics, we find unambiguous evidence of a shot coming from the right front. Mm-hmm. Now, developing that, of course, is the evidence from Holland, the Mormon photograph, all sorts of evidence of exactly where that shot came from. And that location is confirmed by acoustic measurements made by acoustic scientists that the shot from the knoll came from about 8 to 10 feet west of the corner of the stockade fence.
In other words, to the left of the corner. 8 to 10 feet to the left.
How to put it? The corner is made of a section of the fence that runs basically north and south, right? And then the other leg of the fence goes east and west. So this is about 8 feet west of the corner. That's what their case. So here we're getting. Look, this is exactly what I was looking for in the homogeneity in the evidence, right? Where you find evidence over here from witnesses match what we get from acoustic science, match what we get from the Zapruder film, match what we get in terms of the throw of impact debris, et cetera, et cetera. Now look where we are. If Kennedy is hit in the head from the right front, right, that means what do we do with all the evidence that he was also hit in the back of the head?
Right.
That his head accelerates forward at 327, 328 for the last few frames, and that the impact debris, and this is completely different, the impact debris not only covered the passenger compartment of the limousine. According to Frazier, who did a forensic examination of the limousine that night, the impact debris went as far forward as the hood ornament on the car. Right?
Yeah.
So that's, you see, what I found in 1979, etc., was that the evidence in the case was conflictful and disparate, and it didn't come together. It didn't create a single picture. Now it does.
I understand. And it could never come together comprehensively, homogeneously, for people who would insist upon either or as opposed to and.
Help me with that. What do you mean?
There are people who have dedicated some parts of their lives to arguing that President Kennedy was shot from behind, and there are other people who would argue to the contrary, that he was shot from the front, and it turns out that they're both right and
he
they're
was shot
both wrong.
From both, and that's,
exactly.
And That's the essence of it.
That's it, exactly. Yeah.
He was shot from both in 3/4 of a second. And that, folks, that tells us everything we need to know about the Kennedy assassination.
Or at least about the mechanics of the forensics and the physical attack. But here's my ultimate question to you, because this is a long road for any human being. And it's got elements of human interest, I would say, even elements of poignancy. And you wrote, without giving away too much, you wrote an exceptionally elegant and eloquent epilogue that referred to something that you chose to do. You and I've had the privilege of being in Dallas with you, but we never, it was really a terribly rainy day on a particular occasion. And so you and I decided not to go down to the...
I remember that,
That's
Alan.
right.
Yeah, right. Yeah.
Well, I always defer to people who are more knowledgeable about philosophy than I, and you thought, hey, we'll get our shoes all muddy, let's just stay in the hotel.
Right.
But my thought with regard to your epilogue is that, let's say for the sake of discussion, you recognized some kind of something that struck you as anomalous in the immediate aftermath of news of the assassination. And then in November of 2019, you went to Dealey Plaza and you sat on the steps, and you had and one of the beautiful things that you said was Dealey Plaza, where it's always 12:30 in the afternoon. But if I may quote this one brief passage, you say, "This whole arduous process began with a monumental failure by the keepers of public memory, the government and the press." And that's where those extraordinary first-generation researchers, critics is what they called themselves, by the way, right? You were just critics of the official version.
Right.
So my question to you at this point, as we close, is can you describe a little bit about how you felt, what occurred to you, philosophically or emotionally, or intellectually for that matter? What did that moment represent to you in terms of the scope and the range and the depth of this journey that you've been on for so many decades?
I guess how important contingency is in the study of history. Because think of it. Let's think of where we would be in the study of this case if Abraham Zapruder had left his camera at home.
The way the Newmans did.
The way the Newmans did. The Newmans, yeah, right. Now, just think of where we would be. We would have none of the details that we have. Or ask the question, if a Dallas motorcyclist had not pressed his mic button on and it stuck on while he rode through Dealey Plaza, we wouldn't have the acoustics evidence. We wouldn't know what happened in Dealey Plaza, folks. It's only because of damn good luck here.
Yeah, serendipity, really.
That we have available evidence which, if analyzed correctly, lead us to the most important fact in the case, which is Kennedy was shot twice in the head, 3/4 of a second apart. And what this also means, of course, is that both of these shots were absolutely lethal. There is no question that the 313 shot did not kill Kennedy.
Right.
Lee Harvey Oswald did not fire that shot, could not have fired that shot.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. I get it. I understand. I'm very grateful to you for allowing us this. It need not go without saying that Last Second in Dallas is available at Amazon.com and at probably booksellers elsewhere, for all I know. Is there anything else that you'd like to conclude with?
No, just thanks, Alan, that you brought your own commitment to this, and that commitment has lasted over years. And so I want to thank you for that commitment.
I'm very privileged. I'm very privileged. We'd like to thank all of you for listening. We invite you to join us at jfkfacts.org, where you will find updates on JFK-related news with the goal of dispelling confusion and establishing an accurate historical record of the JFK story. My sincere thanks to Dr. Josiah Thompson. Thank you for being with us.